Why do we need to know about the book of Revelation? Well, it's a letter sent to God's people from Jesus himself. So if you are a Christian and Christ himself has sent you a letter, you are probably going to want to read it. Even if you aren't a Christian, you might be interested in what such a letter might contain. The thing about this letter is that it's incredibly relevant for our times in the world today. We have some really important things in common with the original audience. They were under pressure. We are under pressure. They were under pressure to compromise and to conform to the dominant culture. And we experience that pressure too. Not in the same way as the first century Christians did, but we are under pressure to take the edge off our faith so that we can be a little more presentable. And I don't think that pressure is going to go away anytime soon. In fact, it will likely increase. There are two different kinds of Christians in the world today, as there were back in the first century. This has to do with two different responses to the pressure to compromise our faith. Some Christians are trying really hard to be faithful. And for these Christians, this book is an encouragement to keep going. Keep Jesus on the throne of their life. Some Christians today, like some of those in the first century, are going to ask, what pressure? What are you even talking about? The book of Revelation is also for Christians who feel very little pressure from our culture. The ones that just go with the flow and feel very little tension between the demands of culture and our allegiance to Jesus as Lord of life. For this second kind of Christian, the book of Revelation is a bit of a wake-up call. So this book was written for us. But like every other book in the Bible, it wasn't written directly to us. And because we are not the original audience, it was not written in a way that we necessarily understand. This video series is an attempt to help us to understand this letter from our Lord and King, Jesus Christ. I have long been interested in the book of Revelation, partly because it's the last book of the Bible, and that's got to be significant, and partly because I find all kinds of weird interpretations of it, and those are kind of intriguing. Like there are going to be only 144,000 people in heaven, or that the locusts that were as big as a horse and had a human face, and those wings that made the sound of horse-drawn chariots charging into battle. Some people say that those were prophecies of modern-day helicopters. And of course, the red dragon represents the Soviet Union. For obvious reasons, not too many people hold to that idea anymore. So I read a lot of books about Revelation, and I got a lot of my questions answered. But then I read one that really got me excited. It explained the book of Revelation, but it also helped me to know and love Jesus more. That book was Darrell W. Johnson's Discipleship on the Edge. This is the book upon which I will draw quite a bit of the content for these videos, in the hopes that you too will come to know and love Jesus more. Before we start reading this last book of the Bible, I will give you 7 things that you need to remember while you're reading it. If you forget any one of these 7 things, you are in danger of reading it all wrong. The first thing we need to remember is the title. Did you know that the actual name of this book is called The Apocalypse of Jesus Christ? It is. Apocalypse means revelation. It does not mean buildings collapsing and downed power lines and burnt out cars and zombies. The Greek word for these kinds of things is cataclysm or catastrophe. Apocalypse means revelation. The title is The Revelation of Jesus Christ. Here's what John himself says in verse 1. The revelation from Jesus Christ, which God gave him to show his servants what must take place. The book is called The Revelation of Jesus Christ, and in the first verse it also says that it is from Jesus Christ, and once we start reading it, it's clearly about Jesus Christ as well. So here's what we can take from all this. The primary purpose of this book is to reveal Jesus. So it's not about other things. It's not some sort of crystal ball for predicting future events. It does not give us a bunch of predictions about end-time scenarios. It's about the sovereignty, victory, and presence of King Jesus with his people. So by remembering the title, we remember that the book is all about Jesus. The second thing we need to remember about this book in order to understand it is that it's massively symbolic. For instance, I don't think there's a single number in this whole book that is to be taken literally. They all point to something else. And it's not just the numbers. In this book, we find the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse, and the beast with 7 heads and 10 horns, and the lambs with 7 horns and 7 eyes, and the woman clothed in the sun, and a lake of fire. And this list is just scratching the surface. Some of the images in this book are drawn from life and the government in imperial Rome, but most of it comes from the Old Testament, from books like Daniel, Ezekiel, Isaiah, and the Exodus. In Revelation, John quotes the Old Testament 150 times, and there are around 250 allusions to it. All these symbols point to spiritual truths and historical realities. So we need to know how to read these images and symbols in order to understand this book. And this isn't a simple task. This is a lot of what we'll be doing in this video series. A third thing we need to keep in mind while we are reading this book is that it's pastoral and not just prophetic. Pastoral means that as it was read out loud to Christian communities, it was meant to strengthen and to bring comfort to those who faced suffering, pressure, and persecution. According to Darrell Johnson, it does this in two ways. First, it shows us the future to help us make sense of the present. The present makes a lot more sense if we can see where things are going, right? And the second way that this book brings strength and comfort is that it simply reveals unseen realities of the present. And the center of these unseen realities is the crucified, risen, reigning, and coming Jesus of Nazareth. Johnson says that if you read this book and you walk away with something other than Jesus, you've misread the book. Another thing we need to remember is that worship is central to Revelation. John witnesses the vision on the Lord's Day, worshiping. Worshiping is a dominant theme throughout. The whole thing calls believers to align their worship with the Lamb, with Jesus Christ, and to turn from the idols or powers of the world. The fifth thing. Even though there are some pretty confusing things in this book, the big picture is pretty clear. Jesus has already won. The cross and resurrection are decisive victories over sin and death and Satan. The book reminds Christians to live in the light of this victory, even as they await its ultimate fulfillment. The sixth thing we need to keep in mind. Revelation doesn't follow a strict chronological timeline. It's organized into cycles of visions. These cycles are often telling the same story, from different angles, focusing on the spiritual realities behind worldly events. This is the reason why as you read it, you feel like you've gotten to some sort of ending, and then John shifts to describing a whole new scene, and we seem to be back at the beginning of something again. Johnson suggests that Jesus puts on a living drama for John. Jesus is putting on a play. And John just describes what he sees. So there are actors and costume changes and scene changes. It's helpful for us to see the structure of this play so that we know where we are at as we read it. This play has a prologue and an epilogue, a beginning bit and an ending bit. And between these two bits, we have this big vision. And this middle part of the play has 5 acts. Some people have suggested that this big vision has 7 acts and that each act has 7 scenes. This idea is intriguing because of the significance of the number 7 in biblical literature. It's the number of completeness. And there are a lot of 7s in this book that we will see when we get going. But Johnson thinks that this whole 7-act, 7-scene thing is a bit forced. And I do too. He believes that the structure of this book hinges on the word open. Apocalypse kind of means open, so that makes sense. A door is opened, the temple in heaven is opened, the temple of the tabernacle of testimony opens, and heaven is opened. The word open appears 4 times in this vision, and that will divide the main part of the book into 5 acts. It's a 5-act play. In Act 1, Jesus is standing among the churches. In Act 2, we are in a throne room. In Act 3, we witness a cosmic battle. Then in Act 4, we're back in the throne room again. And in Act 5, Jesus begins with riding in on a horse. So to understand this play, you need to know that this story isn't chronological. Johnson quotes Michael Wilcock, who says that you don't ask what happens next as you read this book. You ask, what did John see next? And lastly, Revelation is ultimately about hope. The final chapters of Revelation show us the renewal of all things, a new heaven and a new earth, and the eternal presence of God himself with his people. This is the end of the story. It's the promise of a glorious future where evil is vanquished and God's kingdom is fully realized. Understanding Revelation requires us to focus on the central message. Jesus is Lord and he reigns over history. The book is not about fear or confusion, but about worship and hope and faithfulness in the face of trials. By understanding it symbolically, pastorally, and theologically, we can grasp its enduring relevance and power for all Christians in all times. Thank you, and we'll see you in the next video of the Apocalypse of Jesus Christ.